king of Israel we were talking about last week. How many of you were here last week? I see a lot of faces that I saw last week, but some that were not here. So, last week we talked about a king, and I think he had a really cool name. One that's fun to say. Does anybody remember the king's name that we said last week? We said it all together. It starts with an H. Like that. And then it has a Z in it. Hezebeth. I don't think Hezebeth is the name. Have you heard of a king whose name starts with Hezreel? That's a better try than Hezebeth, but it's not Hezebeth and it's not Hezreel. One more try. Is this a real name? Or are you making up something? Let's hear it. Let's hear it. What you got? Are you getting helps? You don't even know you're getting helps. Come on. We're going to vote on your name. What do you got? Oh, you're too slow. It's not Hezebeth. It's not Hezreel. What? Resurrection. Is that a real name? No. That's not even a Bible name. That's what? So, Maddie, Abby, and Lamar, all together. 1, 2, 3.
Hezekiah.
Very good. That wasn't 1, 2, 3 Hezekiah, but Hezekiah. That's right. Now, even more important than his name, we learned something that Hezekiah did. Seems like he did it all the time, over and over and over again. We learned something that Hezekiah did, and it's something that we should do. Does anybody remember what we learned to do from Hezekiah? He prayed. That's right. He prayed. And when he prayed, now this is getting even harder. And when he prayed, he did 4 things. Remember? First, when he prayed, do you remember first what he did? Or one of them? He humbled himself? Well, that's in the verse. But that's not one of them that we said last week. He worshiped God. Remember? He worshiped God, and then he confessed sin, and he gave thanks, and then he asked for something. He made a request. He asked for something. Now, Hezekiah was a king, right? He was a king. So that means he was in charge of everything. Why would a king ever need anything? The king doesn't need anything, does he? So, but does he? What did King Hezekiah need last week? He needed something, and so he went and asked God. I just bit my tongue. Again, same spot as last night. He asked God, he needed something. Even though he was the king, he needed something. What? In the war, that's right. He had an enemy come against him, and the enemy said that he was going to come and just wipe all of his people out and capture him and all that. And so Hezekiah went to God, and he asked him to help. He even laid out the letter there before God and showed God what the enemy had said. And did God answer his prayer? He did. God sent the angel and killed all the enemy soldiers. Now, so even though Hezekiah was a king, and it seems like he wouldn't need anything, he needed help when his enemies came against him. And today, we're going to see something else that he needed that he couldn't take care of himself even though he was king. King Hezekiah, he'd been king for maybe about 10 or 12 years. And all of a sudden, he got an infection. He got an infection, and it was one of those pussy, ooey, it was really yucky. It was like a boil, and his infection, and I don't know if it was on his arm, I don't know where it was, but he couldn't make it go away. And so the prophet Isaiah came to him and said, Hezekiah, God said, you're not going to recover from this sickness that you have. You're going to die. And so, you need to set your house in order, is what he says. If there's anything you need to take care of before you die, you need to make sure this person gets that, and that person does this, and whatever. You do that because you're not going to get healed from this sickness. Well, now that's something that a king can't take care of, right? He's sick. He was gonna die. So what do you think King Hezekiah did? What did King Hezekiah do almost all the time? Seems like he did it all the time. Whenever he had trouble, he did something. Avery, what do you think? Pray. That's right. He did. Hezekiah, he heard from Isaiah, and when he heard that, he thought, well, I guess I'm not. He went to his bed and he laid down before God and he prayed to God. So, Hezekiah prayed when he needed protection from the big enemy, and he prayed when he was going to get sick. When he was sick and he heard he wasn't going to get well, and began to pray to God, and God, you think God heard his prayer? Because Hezekiah was a good king, wasn't he? Hezekiah was humble, and he prayed, and he sought God's face, and he turned from his wicked ways. And so, the Bible says when we do that, what happens? Then will I hear from heaven. Right? So, God heard Hezekiah's prayer, and God decided something. And he told his prophet Isaiah, remember that Isaiah is one of God's prophets? He told his prophet Isaiah almost right away, he said, go back and tell Hezekiah that I heard his prayer, and I'm going to let him live for 15 more years. I'm going to let him live for 15 more years. And to prove that this is true, I'm going to make the sun go backwards. Now, in those days, they didn't have watches. But if they had a watch, it would be like making the clock, well, making the clock go this way instead of forward. They would stick like a stick up in the air, and the sun would shine on it. You know how how the tree makes a shadow, and if you stood in the morning the shadow goes this way, and in the nighttime it goes this way. God made the sun go back 10 degrees, and the shadow moved. Now, can we explain how that happened? No, we just say God must have did it. It cannot be explained. And if that happened, well, so Isaiah went and told Hezekiah that, and said, in 3 days, your boil is going to be gone, you're going to be healed, you're going to be able to go into the temple and worship. And God said he's going to move the sun back 10 degrees, and the sun moved back 10 degrees. Now, I got a question for you. If the sun moved 10 degrees, I don't know how long 10 degrees is, but if the sun moved 10 degrees here, where else did it move 10 degrees? What do you think, Aiden? Don't know? What do you think, Jasmine? Around the whole earth. That's right. Everybody. Now, some people might not have been paying attention. Maybe they just thought, they got to the end of the day and they thought, wow, that's been a long day. I'm a lot more tired than I normally am. But people that were paying attention, they saw the sun go backwards and thought, wow, what happened? That never happened in my whole life. Never even heard of anything like that happening. Sun moving backwards. And so, there was actually some people in Babylon who were pretty wise men. They had some people that paid attention. In Babylon, they heard about that. And then they started hearing that it was because there was a king in Israel who was sick, and now he wasn't sick anymore. So, Babylon, you guys probably want to know where Babylon is, right? This right here, way here, this is Israel. This is Jerusalem. And who lived in Jerusalem? God put his house in Jerusalem. But who's the king in Jerusalem? Well, one of David's sons, a long time later. We said his name earlier today. Who's the king in Jerusalem? He got sick.
Hezekiah.
Right? Is she right? Yes. Okay, so Hezekiah is here. He gets sick, and then he prays, and God says, I'm going to heal you, and to prove it, I'm going to make the sun go back. And all the way over in Babylon, they saw that the sun went back. And then they started hearing why. They heard it was because Hezekiah was sick, and now he was well. And so the king over in Babylon, he said, you know what? I want to find out about this. If Hezekiah was able some way to make the sun move, he must be somebody special. Did the king in Babylon believe in the God of heaven? No. He worshipped idols. He didn't know about the God up in heaven, but he was just kind of curious about what Hezekiah did. And so he sent some people to see Hezekiah. And Hezekiah, the Bible says that God tested Hezekiah by sending these men from Babylon. So these men came to see Hezekiah, and Hezekiah was thinking, wow, people, men, special men, all the way from Babylon, long way away, have heard about me. And they come to see what I have. And so Hezekiah started showing his men around. He showed them all the gold and silver that he had. And he showed them all the spears and swords that he had. He showed them how strong of an army he had. He showed them everything in Jerusalem and everything everywhere else in his kingdom. What do you think was happening to Hezekiah? What do we call it when we kind of like, oh, I'm special? What's that? What is it when we say, well, I'm special? You ever, pride? Does it sound like pride? If I was like, look at me, look at what I did. That sounds like pride, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah, it was. Hezekiah was proud. He started thinking, I don't know why, but he thought God was super special to him because he got healed. And then he thought that all this stuff that he had. How did Hezekiah have all this stuff? Why did Hezekiah have all this stuff? God, if it wasn't for God, wouldn't those 185,000 soldiers have taken all that stuff before? Sure thing. Yeah, but Hezekiah was like, look at all the things I have. And that was pride. That was pride. So, he showed this man all these things, and they left. And you know who came wanting to talk to Hezekiah right away after that? Who do you think came wanting to talk to Hezekiah? What do you think? It wasn't Jesus. Jesus wasn't on the earth at this time. But it was somebody from God, God's prophet. His name was Isaiah. Isaiah came to Hezekiah, and think about this. He came to Hezekiah and he said, who were those men that came and visited? And Hezekiah said, oh, they were from way far away, long way away in Babylon. There were some men that came from long far away, and they came to see us and and our country. And Isaiah said, well, what did you show them? What did they see? And what did Hezekiah tell them? He said, well, I showed them everything. I showed them all my treasures, and I showed them all my shields and spears and swords. And Isaiah said, someday, all of your treasures and all of your spears and swords and everything are going to be carried away and taken all the way to Babylon. Oh, no. Hezekiah thought, I didn't think that was going to happen, but it did. Hezekiah, he got proud, didn't he? He got proud. Now, and he failed the test that God gave him, didn't he? So, Hezekiah, Isaiah told him that these things, these bad things, would not happen while he was alive, though. So he was able to live and then die, and then the things that God said would happen would happen. And what happens when the king dies? Who becomes king after the king? His son. So, King Hezekiah had a son who became the next king, and his name was Manasseh. Now, Manasseh, the Bible tells us he was way different than his dad. King Hezekiah, almost all the time, he obeyed God, right? He feared God. He prayed to God. But King Manasseh, he didn't. I don't know why, but he must have thought, I don't want to do that stuff. And he started doing his own thing. Do you think if he's doing his own thing, do you think King Manasseh worshipped God? No. Do you think he went into the temple to offer sacrifices like he was supposed to? No. He started thinking, I don't need to do that stuff. He says, I don't need to do that. I want to do this. What is it when we say, I want to do something? It's kind of like it's rebellion, isn't it? I don't want to do what I'm supposed to do. I'm going to do this. And sometimes, a lot of times, we do that because we think we're something. Manasseh must have thought, I'm the king. I can do whatever I want. can do whatever I want. I'm the king. That's pride, isn't it? Well, Manasseh, he set up idols all over the city. He even got a big carved idol and put it in where the temple was. God sent some prophets to him. It wasn't Isaiah this time, but he sent some other prophets and said, God is going to judge you for that. And King Manasseh, he was like, I don't care about that. He was just wanted to do his own thing. He didn't change. He didn't do anything. He just did his own thing. And guess what happened? It's really interesting. God sent the Assyrians against his country. And I don't know exactly. I've been trying to think about how this happened because they didn't capture Jerusalem, but they captured King Manasseh. I think King Manasseh was out with his army, maybe with his special men. And the Bible says he was in a thicket. He got caught in the bushes, and the Assyrian soldiers must have found him, and they caught him, and they knew he was the king. And so they dragged him off, and this is what they did to him. They bound him up in chains, and I don't know if you can see that. They put a hook in his nose. Wow. Almost like, you might not have ever seen something like this, but farmers sometimes will put a big ring in a cow's nose, and they lead the cow around, and they put a hook in King Manasseh's nose, and they led him off to Babylon. The Assyrians took him to Babylon. Now, you think Hezekiah was really stuck up and full of pride with a hook in his nose and chains? That took care of his pride, didn't it? Sure enough, God judged him because he was full of pride. And Manasseh got carried off to Babylon. The Bible said Manasseh was there in Babylon for a couple of years. And when Manasseh was there in Babylon, we don't know exactly what happened. But he must have been thinking about he probably thought about his dad. Who was Manasseh's dad? Who was Manasseh's dad? We've been talking about it, Hezekiah. And he must have been thinking, Hezekiah, my dad, he would pray to God. He depended on God for the things. And maybe even, because this verse, what God said here, had been said a long time before. Maybe even Manasseh thought about this verse. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from, we don't know. Turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sins. We don't know exactly what happened, why. But after a while, the Bible says that Manasseh, wicked Manasseh, he was a wicked. In fact, he was so bad, he offered some of his children, he offered them as sacrifices. He killed them, offered them to idols. It's wicked, wicked, wicked sin. Awful man. The Bible says he decided that he was going to pray to God. Now, do you think God would hear the prayer of a wicked man like Manasseh? Would God hear the prayer of a wicked man like Manasseh? What do you think? Manny says, yeah, he would hear everybody. Somebody else says, no. What does our verse say? Our verse says that my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves. Now, if I just go and do whatever I want and I say, God, do this for me, is that humble? No. But the Bible says if they humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then what? I will hear from heaven. So Manasseh must have thought, all those things I did before, those were bad and evil. And he'd been humbled by the soldiers, but he humbled himself, and he began to pray to God, and he turned from his wicked ways, and God heard Manasseh's prayer too. God heard Manasseh's prayer. An evil, wicked Manasseh, God heard his prayer. And the Bible says God forgave his sins, and he also allowed him to go back and to be king again. Here he was in Babylon, in chains, with a hook in his nose. But God heard his prayer and let him go back to Israel and let him become the king in Jerusalem again. And you know what he did when he came back as the king? You think he went back and did his old things? No, he didn't. He broke them all down, and he tried to get his people to do what was right. He tried to get them to turn back to God too. So, quickly, I want to tell you about one more thing. The people in Jerusalem, they would have seen Manasseh, and they might have known about that hook in his nose, and they might have thought, who did that? Who did that to Manasseh? Who was fighting? Who captured all the Israelites? It was the Assyrians, right? And the Assyrians were a cruel people. And they had captured all the other Israelites and taken them off, and the people in Jerusalem might have been thinking they were really afraid of the Assyrians. They didn't want them to come and capture them and torture them and do anything like that. The Assyrians were a cruel, cruel people. And God knew them. In fact, and the capital city of the Assyrians was Nineveh. Does anybody ever heard of the city of Nineveh? Does anybody remember a man who was told to go and preach to Nineveh? Anybody? No, we don't remember that. This man, he was afraid of the Ninevites. He was afraid of the Assyrians because they were a wicked and cruel people, and he did not want to go and preach to them. In fact, when he was told to go preach to the people of Nineveh, he decided to go the other way. Does anybody now remember what his name was? You don't remember his name? What did he do? He was on a boat. That's right. So he was on a boat, and then what happened? Well, there was a big storm, and so they threw him over, and a great fish, a whale, swallowed him up. Now, does anybody know the name of the prophet that God sent to Nineveh that didn't go and got swallowed by a whale? Who? Hezekiah? No, Hezekiah is not the answer to that question. It was Jonah. Remember Jonah and the whale? Yeah. Well, there was another. That's just to remind us of how wicked the Ninevites were. But Jonah finally went there, and the people, they turned from their sin and they turned to God. Well, like 100 years later, they forgot about that and they were wicked. And so God sent Nahum. Does anybody remember the name Nahum? If you've said the books of the Old Testament, you've said the word Nahum. Nahum was a prophet to Israel, and he prophesied to comfort the people of Israel about the wicked, cruel people in Nineveh. Now, I don't have time to go through everything that Nahum said, but let me just say that Nahum told the people of Israel, the people in Jerusalem, that God was going to judge those people for all their wickedness, and he was going to, among other things, he was going to send an army in there with chariots and spears, and he was going to kill so many of them that the dead people would be piled in the streets, and their city would be destroyed, and no one would ever rebuild it. Now that sounds almost impossible to believe, but I can tell you that because God said it, it happened. Doesn't everything that God says happen? If it hasn't happened yet, it will happen. Everything that he has said will happen either has or will. And so many things that he said will happen has already happened. We know everything else he said will happen. In fact, the city of Nineveh, do you think the city of Nineveh, the place where the city of Nineveh is on the earth today? It is. Everything we read in the Bible is real places. And the place where Nineveh is, do you think there's a city there? No. Because God said it would be destroyed and no one would ever rebuild it. And there's not a city there. We could go there today. Well, it would take us longer than a day to get there. But we could, if we were there today, we would see the ruins of a great city. But no city there. Because God said he was going to destroy them and they would become a ruin. So God, and you know what? One of the reasons that Nineveh was destroyed is because they were full of pride. They thought they were great and they could do anything and they didn't care. And so God judges those that are full of pride. In fact, God hates pride. Did God judge Hezekiah's pride? He didn't. Remember, he was proud and he thought, oh, this gold, and so this is because of me. And God sent judgment to him. Did God judge Manasseh's pride? Yes, he did. And God judged Nineveh's pride also. But if we're sinners, if we're God's people, and we humble ourselves, pride and humility are two different things, aren't they? Okay? So if you have pride, you're not humble. If you have pride, you need to humble yourself. So if we humble ourselves and then pray and seek God's face and turn from our sin, then God will hear our prayers, won't He? He'll forgive our sin. And in the land, He will heal our land. Do you think America has pride? You don't think? I think America has lots of pride. Americans think they can do whatever they want. They think they can say, we don't care what God says. We want a man to be able to marry a man. Or we want a woman to be able to marry a woman. Does God say that's okay? No, that's a wicked, evil sin. But America is so full of pride, it thinks it can do whatever it wants. And if we look at what happened to Nineveh and every other city and country in history, God doesn't bless pride, does He? God hates pride. Whether it's in our own heart or in our country. How many of you, each one of us, it's easy to be full of pride, isn't it? All of us do something maybe better than somebody else, but is it because of us? If we think we're better than them because we can do something better than them, that's pride. And we need to not have pride. All right. Somebody's going to sing a song or tell us a story.
Everybody's